The first morning light. The sun had only just begun to rise over Thompson Park, casting a gentle warmth across the small oasis of trees, flowers, and grass nestled in the heart of Oakwood. Dew clung to the blades of grass, glinting like tiny jewels in the first light of dawn. The park was a sanctuary for early risers, frequented by joggers, dog walkers, and people seeking a moment of solitude. In this quiet hour, before the city fully awakened, the park felt like a world of its own. In the center of the park, sitting on an old wooden bench, was Mr. Charles Anderson. He was a tall, dignified man with skin as rich and deep as polished mahogany, and age had granted him silver hair that shimmered in the light. At 78, he held himself with the grace and poise that only a lifetime of resilience could bring. His back was straight, his head held high, and in his eyes lingered the soft glint of someone who had seen much of the world and had come to find peace with it. He had been an educator for more than 40 years, teaching history and literature to generations of young minds. Now, in his retirement, he cherished these quiet Sunday mornings, sipping his coffee, reading the paper, and watching life unfold around him. Mr. Anderson had been coming to this bench every Sunday morning for the past 12 years. It had become a ritual, one that he treasured, a brief, sacred pause in life's hurried rhythm. He often said he felt at home here, under the open sky, surrounded by nature. But perhaps more than anything, he valued the simple pleasure of sitting in his park, a place that represented both community and solitude, where he could reflect on his life and watch the world go by. As he sipped his coffee, his thoughts drifted to memories of his youth. He had grown up in the era of the civil rights movement, bearing witness to the waves of change and resistance that swept the country. It had been a time of hope, a time of struggle, and a time when courage was a currency not everyone was willing to spend. He remembered marching alongside his friends and family, chanting for justice, demanding a world that would one day recognize the humanity in all people. Those days had been filled with both fear and hope, the tension of progress, and the constant reminder of how much was yet to be done. Now, sitting on his park bench in a seemingly peaceful world, he couldn't help but wonder how much of that hope had been realized, and how much of it remained a dream. Lost in thought, he didn't notice the young police officer approaching until he heard footsteps on the gravel path beside him. The officer was Officer Ben Carter, fresh-faced and keen, perhaps in his mid-20s. With a stiff posture and a serious expression, he walked directly toward Mr. Anderson, his eyes fixed on him with an intensity that felt out of place in the gentle calm of the park. Mr. Anderson looked up, meeting the officer's gaze with a polite nod, and returned to his newspaper, assuming it was a simple matter of routine. But the officer lingered, shifting his weight as if he had something to say. "Good morning, sir," Officer Carter said, his tone firm but uneasy. There was a hint of impatience in his voice, as if he were eager to establish control over the situation, whatever it might be. "Good morning, officer," Mr. Anderson replied, setting his newspaper aside. His voice was calm, warm, and polite. "Can I help you with something?" The officer hesitated, glancing around as if to survey the scene. His posture straightened, and he took a step closer. "This is public property, sir. I just need to make sure everyone here is allowed to be here." "Can I ask what you're doing?" Mr. Anderson raised an eyebrow, taken aback. He wasn't sure he had heard correctly. "Allowed to be here," he repeated, a touch of disbelief creeping into his voice. "I've been sitting on this bench every Sunday for years." Officer Carter crossed his arms, his gaze growing sharper. "I understand, sir, but it's my job to ensure the safety and order of the community," he said, a tone of suspicion laced with an edge of defensiveness. "Can I see some identification?" For a moment, Mr. Anderson felt a rush of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and then a sense of indignation that he had learned to suppress over the years. But he took a deep breath, steadying himself. After all, he had been through far worse. He had learned the art of patience, of navigating the moments when others failed to see him for who he was: a husband, a father, a teacher, a man who had given his life to his community. "Officer," he began, his voice even and composed, "I'm just here, enjoying the morning. There's no need for concern. I'm not causing any trouble, I assure you." But the officer's stance remained firm, and his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. "I still need to see some ID, sir," he repeated, his tone growing more insistent. It was clear that, for him, this was no longer a polite request, but an assertion of authority. Mr. Anderson reached slowly into his pocket, pulling out his wallet and offering his ID. His hands were steady, his gaze unwavering. As he handed over his ID, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness, a reminder of the biases that still lingered, hidden just below the surface of everyday life. He had hoped that the world his children grew up in would be different, a world where one's skin color or age did not invite suspicion. But here he was, facing a young man who, perhaps unknowingly, carried those very prejudices within him. As Officer Carter studied the ID, a small crowd began to gather. People passing by slowed their pace, their eyes moving between the officer and the elderly man on the bench. There were murmurs of confusion, concern, and even a few murmurs of support for Mr. Anderson. Some looked on in sympathy, others in silent outrage, and the park's usual calm was replaced by a growing tension. After a few moments, Officer Carter handed the ID back, still not fully convinced. "Look, I'm just doing my job," he said, his tone defensive, as if bracing himself against any criticism. "We have rules, and it's my duty to enforce them." Mr. Anderson took his ID back, his face impassive. "I understand, officer," he said, his voice steady but laced with a sadness that only a lifetime of such encounters could instill. "But enforcing rules requires judgment, respect, and sometimes a bit of understanding. I hope you'll consider that in the future." Before Officer Carter could respond, a firm voice interrupted from behind him. "Is there a problem here?" The officer turned, and Mr. Anderson looked up to see a man with a confident stance and a composed expression approaching them. The man wore a dark suit, and his presence commanded immediate respect. He was Marcus Rivers, a well-known attorney and civil rights advocate who had spent years fighting for justice and equality in Oakwood. Tall, with skin as dark as the evening sky and a look of steely determination in his eyes, he had been a voice for the community, speaking out against injustice wherever it appeared. Mr. Anderson knew him well. They had shared many conversations about the world, about progress, and about the work that still needed to be done. "Is everything all right, Mr. Anderson?" Marcus asked, his gaze shifting between the officer and the elderly man on the bench. "Yes, Marcus," Mr. Anderson replied, his tone calm but grateful. "I was just explaining to the officer here that I have as much right to sit in this park as anyone else." Marcus's expression hardened as he turned to Officer Carter. "I think that's clear, officer. This man has dedicated his life to this community. If anyone deserves a place in this park, it's him." The young officer looked momentarily stunned, then defensive. "I'm just following protocol," he muttered, but his voice lacked the conviction it had held before. Marcus took a step closer, his voice firm but respectful. "Protocol doesn't replace respect, officer. Sometimes doing your job requires seeing people for who they are." The tension hung heavy in the air, but Marcus's words seemed to cut through it, grounding everyone in a reminder of what was truly at stake: the dignity and respect of every person, regardless of who they were or where they came from. The crowd murmured in approval, and slowly the officer stepped back, his face a mixture of frustration and realization. The crowd dispersed, leaving Mr. Anderson and Marcus alone on the bench, each of them reflecting on the moment. For Mr. Anderson, it was another reminder of the journey they still had to travel. And for Marcus, it was a call to action, a reminder of the work that lay ahead, and the need for a stronger, united community that could stand up against these quiet injustices. They sat together in silence, both knowing that this moment, small as it seemed, was a spark that could ignite the change they had long fought for. A community stirred. The morning's events at Thompson Park echoed far beyond its boundaries, rippling through Oakwood with the urgency of a rising tide. It wasn't long before conversations sparked in cafes, on street corners, and around dinner tables. The small but profound interaction between Mr. Charles Anderson, Officer Carter, and Marcus Rivers had stirred something in the community. A realization that some of the prejudices they had hoped were fading were still very much alive. In the days that followed, Mr. Anderson found himself at the heart of a dialogue that was growing louder with every passing hour. Friends and neighbors approached him with words of support, some expressing outrage, others sharing their own stories of quiet encounters that left deep, unspoken scars. The community felt a mix of pride for Mr. Anderson's quiet dignity and a shared indignation that he had to face such a situation at all. As the days wore on, it became clear that the incident was not going to fade into silence. People began organizing small gatherings to discuss how they felt, and soon these impromptu discussions grew into a larger community meeting at Oakwood's modest but well-loved community center. Mr. Anderson arrived at the center that evening, unsure of what to expect. He was accompanied by Marcus Rivers, who had been by his side since that morning in the park. Marcus had insisted on helping to organize the event, knowing that Oakwood's residents needed a safe space to air their concerns, frustrations, and hopes for change. The center was bustling when they arrived, filled with residents of all ages, each face reflecting a different shade of concern, hope, or frustration. Mr. Anderson felt a swell of gratitude as he scanned the room, seeing so many familiar faces, parents of his former students, neighbors, friends he had known for decades. It was a reminder that despite the challenges they faced, they were bound by a strong, enduring sense of community. Marcus took his place at the front of the room, raising his hand to call for quiet. His tall frame and composed presence commanded attention, and the room quickly fell silent. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice firm but laced with the warmth that came from a deep love for his community. "We're here tonight to address something that affects all of us. What happened to Mr. Anderson was not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger issue that we, as a community, need to confront together." There was a murmur of agreement as people nodded, their faces solemn. Marcus continued, "We all know Mr. Anderson. He's been a pillar of this neighborhood for as long as most of us can remember. He's taught our children. He's been a friend to so many, and he's shown this community what it means to live with dignity and compassion. If he isn't safe from discrimination, then none of us are." Marcus looked to Mr. Anderson, who sat quietly in the front row, his gaze steady, his hands folded in his lap. There was a moment of silence as all eyes turned to him. He took a breath, then rose to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate. He hadn't expected to speak tonight, but the weight of the moment called for his voice. "Thank you, Marcus," he began, nodding to his friend before turning to the crowd. "And thank all of you for being here. It means the world to me to see so many people gathered, not just for me, but for something much bigger than myself." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'll admit, what happened to me in the park that morning took me by surprise. I've lived through my share of hardships. I grew up in a time when being treated differently was simply part of life for a man who looked like me. I'd hoped that things had changed, but I was reminded that we still have a long way to go." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the people who had been his neighbors, friends, and students for so many years. "But I don't want to stand here and focus on the wrongs that were done to me. I want us to focus on what we can do together to ensure that no one else has to experience what I did." A wave of applause rippled through the crowd, and Mr. Anderson felt a surge of warmth. He could see the faces of people who had been waiting for this kind of moment. A chance to come together, to work toward a common goal. Marcus stepped forward again, sensing the momentum of the crowd. "So, where do we start?" he asked, his gaze moving around the room, inviting anyone to speak. A young man near the back raised his hand. "We need to bring in the police department," he said, his voice strong but edged with frustration. "They need to hear our side of the story. They need to understand what this is like for us." There was a rumble of agreement, but a middle-aged woman with graying hair shook her head. "But do you really think they'll listen?" she asked, her tone laced with years of doubt and disappointment. "I mean, no offense to the officers who are here tonight, but I'm tired of hearing promises with no real change." At that moment, Officer Morgan, a veteran officer known for his friendly demeanor and dedication to the community, raised his hand. He had been sitting quietly in the back, but now he stood up, facing the crowd with a look of calm resolve. "I understand where you're coming from," he began, his voice steady. "And you have every right to feel that way. I know there are officers who don't do right by this community, and I don't excuse that. But I believe there are also many of us who want to do better, who want to understand the people we serve, and who want to build trust." Officer Morgan's words seemed to resonate with the crowd, softening the tension in the room. "What happened to Mr. Anderson shouldn't have happened," he continued. "And I'm here because I believe we need to listen to you. We need to understand your experiences so that we can do better." A woman sitting near the front, a local teacher named Ms. Alvarez, raised her hand. "What if we create a group?" she suggested. "A place where the police and the community can meet regularly to discuss these issues. Not just a one-time meeting, but something ongoing, something that keeps us connected and working together." Marcus nodded, a glimmer of excitement in his eyes. "I think that's a great idea. We could form a community coalition, a group of residents and officers who meet on a regular basis to address concerns, share perspectives, and hold each other accountable." The crowd buzzed with enthusiasm, and Marcus quickly scribbled down the idea on a notepad. "All right," he said, his voice growing louder to cut through the chatter. "Let's get organized. If we're going to make a real difference, we need a plan." Over the next hour, the community worked together to lay the foundation for what would soon become the Oakwood Community Coalition for Justice and Understanding. They discussed the logistics of their meetings, their goals, and the kinds of programs they wanted to implement. Ideas flowed freely, each one building upon the last, and the energy in the room was electric. By the end of the night, the group had sketched out a plan for the coalition's first official meeting. They would invite police representatives, including Officer Carter, to join them in an open forum where they could share their experiences and work toward common solutions. They also decided to organize workshops on bias, empathy, and cultural understanding, which would be open to both residents and law enforcement officers. As the meeting drew to a close, Mr. Anderson looked around the room, his heart swelling with pride. This was more than he had hoped for, a community united, not by anger or bitterness, but by a shared desire for change. He saw young people eager to make a difference, elders bringing their wisdom, and neighbors who were ready to stand together. Marcus closed the meeting with a few final words, his voice filled with a fierce determination. "Tonight, we took the first step, but this is only the beginning. Change doesn't come easy, and it doesn't come fast. It's a slow, steady journey, and it requires every single one of us to stay committed. I believe in this community. I believe that we can make a difference. Let's prove it." As the crowd dispersed, Mr. Anderson lingered by the door, shaking hands and exchanging words of encouragement with friends and neighbors. Many people stopped to thank him for his strength and grace, but he was quick to deflect the praise. "We're all in this together," he told them. "I'm just one person. It's all of you who make this community what it is." Finally, as the last few people trickled out, Mr. Anderson and Marcus found themselves alone in the quiet of the community center. They stood together in silence, each reflecting on the night's events. "You've started something powerful, Charles," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "This coalition has the potential to change everything." Mr. Anderson smiled, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Maybe so," he replied softly. "But it's only worth it if we can truly make a difference for everyone." As they locked up the center and stepped out into the cool night air, both men felt a renewed sense of purpose. They knew that the path ahead would not be easy. They would face challenges, resistance, and moments of doubt. But they also knew that, together, they had the power to reshape their community, to create a place where people like Mr. Anderson could sit on a park bench without fear, and where justice and understanding could thrive. The night sky stretched above them, vast and star-filled, as they walked side by side toward the future that they were determined to build, breaking down the walls. The energy from the initial community meeting lingered in Oakwood, a quiet but persistent force that spurred neighbors, friends, and even strangers into action. The Oakwood Community Coalition for Justice and Understanding had been officially formed, and word spread quickly. People across the neighborhood talked of it with a mix of hope and cautious optimism. The coalition's first official gathering was set to take place in Oakwood's community center, and as the day approached, Mr. Anderson could feel the significance of the moment growing. He had witnessed many movements in his life, each beginning with a small but powerful step. He knew the weight of this particular one, too, sensing that the community had reached a tipping point. This coalition could either begin to close the divide between the residents and law enforcement, or risk opening old wounds even wider. On the evening of the first coalition meeting, Mr. Anderson arrived early, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and nerves. The community center was alive with the hum of preparations, chairs being arranged, tables set up for refreshments, and flyers being handed out with the coalition's mission statement printed boldly at the top. Marcus Rivers, ever organized and composed, moved through the room with a clipboard, ensuring everything was ready. "You nervous, Charles?" Marcus asked as he approached Mr. Anderson, a knowing smile on his face. "A little," Mr. Anderson admitted, chuckling softly. "I've spoken to hundreds of people over the years, but this feels different. The stakes feel higher." Marcus nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Mr. Anderson's shoulder. "It's because they are. But we're ready for this. You've helped us get here, and tonight, we take another step forward." As the clock ticked closer to the start time, residents began to file in, their faces a mix of curiosity, concern, and determination. There were young parents with children, older residents who had lived in Oakwood for decades, and teenagers who had grown up in the neighborhood. But tonight, there was another group present as well, the police officers. They had agreed to send a small delegation to the coalition's first meeting. It was a tentative gesture, but a meaningful one. Officer Morgan was among them, along with two other officers Mr. Anderson hadn't met before, one of whom was Officer Ben Carter, the young officer who had approached him in the park. Mr. Anderson noted how Carter lingered at the back, his face a mix of discomfort and determination, as though he wasn't quite sure of his place in the room. Marcus took the lead, welcoming everyone and thanking them for coming. He was a natural orator, his voice carrying a warmth and authority that commanded the room's attention. After a few introductory words, he invited Mr. Anderson to speak, nodding in encouragement as the older man rose to his feet. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Mr. Anderson began, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the room. "This coalition is more than just a meeting. It's an opportunity for us to come together, to listen to one another, and to try to understand the experiences and fears that we each carry. My hope is that through this group, we can find ways to bridge the gaps that exist between us." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I don't think anyone here would disagree that we've made progress as a society, but we also know that some wounds remain unhealed, and some biases persist in ways that harm people in ways we may not always see. We can't ignore these things if we want to truly move forward." The room fell silent, each person absorbed in Mr. Anderson's words. He felt a quiet strength in their presence, a reminder that despite the pain of the past, people still hoped for a better future. When he finished, Marcus opened the floor for anyone who wished to speak, inviting people to share their experiences or ask questions. A young woman named Sarah, who had recently moved to Oakwood, raised her hand. "I just want to say that I'm so grateful for this coalition," she began, her voice soft but earnest. "I've lived in a few different neighborhoods, and it always felt like there was an invisible wall between the community and the police, I never knew how to feel safe and supported. I hope this coalition can be a way to bring us closer together." There were murmurs of agreement, and Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the room for the next speaker. Tamara, the outspoken activist from the previous meeting, raised her hand. "I'm glad we're here tonight, too," she said, her voice firm. "But I want to make sure that we're not just here to talk. I want to see real change, not just promises. I want accountability, and I want to make sure that no one else has to go through what Mr. Anderson did. If we're going to work with the police, then we need to see a commitment to change." Her words hung heavily in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then, to the surprise of many, Officer Carter stood up, shifting uncomfortably as he looked out at the room. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from," he began, his voice hesitant. "But I'm here because I want to listen and learn. I know I made a mistake with Mr. Anderson, and I deeply regret how I handled that situation. I was wrong, and I'm here because I want to do better." Mr. Anderson watched as the young officer's face shifted between vulnerability and a desire for redemption. There was something in his expression, a mixture of discomfort and humility, that softened the room's tension, even if only slightly. Tamara crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "Words are a good start, Officer Carter, but like I said, we need action. How can we trust that things will be different?" Officer Carter looked down for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I can't speak for everyone, but I know that I can do better. And I know that our department can do better. I'm committed to being part of that change, whatever it takes. I believe this coalition is a step in the right direction." The room buzzed with a mix of skepticism and cautious hope. Marcus took the opportunity to redirect the conversation, his voice calm and steady. "This coalition is about accountability on both sides. We need to hold our officers accountable, yes, but we also need to be willing to come to the table with open minds and a willingness to listen. Tonight, we're here to build something new, but it won't happen unless we're willing to look past our assumptions and judgments." The meeting continued with people sharing their thoughts, some hopeful, others frustrated, but all committed to the cause. By the end of the evening, they had made plans for a series of initiatives aimed at fostering understanding. They decided to organize monthly community forums where residents could voice their concerns directly to police representatives, and they discussed the creation of youth mentorship programs that would allow young people to interact with law enforcement in a positive, supportive environment. As the meeting drew to a close, Marcus announced the formation of an oversight board, which would include community members and police officers alike. The board's purpose would be to review any incidents of concern, ensuring that there was transparency and accountability in Oakwood's law enforcement practices. When it was time to go, Mr. Anderson felt a deep sense of relief and pride. This coalition, this coming together of people from different walks of life, was exactly what he had hoped for. He shook hands with neighbors and exchanged words of encouragement with friends, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Before he left, he approached Officer Carter, who was gathering his things in the back of the room. The young officer looked up, his face guarded, but Mr. Anderson offered a warm smile. "Thank you for coming tonight, Officer Carter," he said, his tone sincere. "It takes courage to stand up and admit when we're wrong. I appreciate your willingness to listen." Officer Carter nodded, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson. I know I have a lot to learn, but I'm committed to this. I want to do better." Mr. Anderson placed a hand on the officer's shoulder, a simple gesture of understanding. "We're all here to learn," he said softly, "and I believe we can do it, together." As he stepped outside, the cool night air filled Mr. Anderson's lungs, bringing with it a sense of renewal. The path ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but tonight they had taken a powerful step forward. In the following weeks, the coalition's efforts began to take shape. The first youth mentorship program was launched, with Officer Morgan volunteering to lead sessions at Oakwood High School. The community forums grew in attendance, each one fostering deeper discussions and more honest exchanges between residents and officers. And the Oversight Board held its inaugural meeting, with Marcus and Mr. Anderson at the helm, ensuring that the coalition's goals were upheld with integrity and transparency. As Mr. Anderson watched his community begin to heal and transform, he felt a deep, quiet joy. The divide between law enforcement and the community had not disappeared overnight, but each small victory brought them one step closer to a future built on mutual respect and understanding. And through it all, Mr. Anderson remained a steady presence, a guiding light for Oakwood, as they worked to dismantle the walls that had long divided them, brick by brick. The voices of Oakwood. With the success of the coalition's first meeting, Oakwood began to buzz with a newfound energy. People were talking, neighbors were coming together, and for the first time in a long time, there was an air of unity, fragile but growing. Word of the coalition and its mission spread, and people who hadn't been involved in the community for years started showing interest, drawn by the hope of a real change. Yet, as the coalition's efforts grew, so did the scrutiny. While many in the community embraced the coalition's goals, some remained skeptical. Old resentments, fueled by years of mistrust and simmering tensions, didn't dissipate overnight. And for others, the coalition's work felt like an uncomfortable spotlight on Oakwood's issues that for some were easier to ignore than confront. To tackle these lingering doubts, the coalition planned a series of community forums titled The Voices of Oakwood. These forums were designed to allow residents to share their experiences openly, inviting officers to listen and respond directly. The hope was that, by creating a safe space for honest dialogue, the coalition could address the painful realities that people carried within them while building understanding and empathy between residents and law enforcement. The first forum was scheduled for a Thursday evening, and the community center was packed. Rows of folding chairs stretched from wall to wall, filling with people from all walks of life. There were parents with young children, teenagers, elders who had lived in Oakwood for decades, and even newcomers who wanted to understand the community they had joined. At the front of the room sat a panel of officers, including Officer Carter, Officer Morgan, and two others who had volunteered to participate. Mr. Anderson and Marcus stood alongside them, ready to facilitate the conversation. As the room settled, Marcus took the microphone, his voice warm yet filled with purpose. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, glancing at the officers and residents with equal regard. "This forum is for all of us, a place where we can listen to each other, learn from each other, and start to heal. Tonight, we'll hear stories that may be difficult to share and even harder to hear. But I ask that we approach each story with respect and compassion. That's the only way forward." A hush fell over the room as Marcus handed the microphone to Mr. Anderson, who took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the significance of the moment. "I want to thank each of you for showing up tonight," he began. "As Marcus said, this is a space for us to listen and to be heard. I know that many of us have felt the weight of mistrust, fear, and even anger in our interactions with law enforcement. And I know that, for many officers, it isn't easy to stand here and hear these stories. But we're all here because we believe we can build a better Oakwood, one where everyone feels seen, respected, and safe." Mr. Anderson scanned the room, meeting the eyes of friends and neighbors before he passed the microphone to the first speaker, a woman in her late 20s named Lila, who had lived in Oakwood her entire life. Lila's face was a mix of strength and vulnerability, her hands clutching the microphone as she prepared to speak. "Thank you," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't usually talk about this, but I feel like I have to tonight." She glanced at the officers on the panel, her gaze lingering on Officer Carter before she continued. "A few years ago, I was stopped by a police officer while walking home from work. I was alone, it was late, and I just felt this fear that I couldn't shake." Her voice cracked, and she took a deep breath before going on. "The officer questioned me, asked where I was going, where I lived, and why I was out so late. I kept thinking, what did I do wrong? Why was I being treated like a suspect just for walking home? I tried to explain, but the officer seemed suspicious. He didn't even believe I lived here. Leila's voice grew stronger, fueled by the memories she was finally allowing herself to share. I've always loved this community. It's my home. But that night, I didn't feel like I belonged. I felt small, like I didn't matter. And that feeling has stayed with me. There was a profound silence in the room as Leila handed the microphone back. Mr. Anderson saw the empathy in the faces around him, the sadness, the anger, and the quiet nods of understanding from those who had felt the same. Officer Carter shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, yet something in his face showed a determination to listen, to absorb Leila's story. Slowly, he leaned forward and took the microphone. "Thank you for sharing that, Leila," he said, his voice tinged with remorse. "I can't pretend to know what that experience was like for you. But hearing you talk about it helps me understand how much our actions affect the people we're supposed to serve. I'm sorry that you had to go through that. And I'm committed to making sure that we, as officers, don't make anyone feel unwelcome in their own neighborhood." A murmur of appreciation passed through the crowd, and Mr. Anderson felt a flicker of hope. This was what they were here for, to create an environment where people could share their truths and be met with respect and understanding. The evening continued with stories from residents young and old, each sharing experiences that, over time, had shaped their relationship with law enforcement. Some spoke of unfair treatment, others of feeling invisible or misunderstood, while a few even shared positive stories of officers who had gone above and beyond to protect and support them. Each story was a piece of the puzzle, revealing the complex, multifaceted relationship between Oakwood's residents and its police force. As the night wore on, a young man named Javier took the microphone. He was tall, with a wiry frame, and an intensity in his gaze that captured the room's attention. "I grew up here," he began, his voice low and steady, "and I've had my fair share of run-ins with the police. Some of it was my own doing. I wasn't always making the best choices, but sometimes I felt like I was being targeted just for being who I am." Javier glanced at Officer Carter, his expression hardening. "Last year, I was pulled over by you, Officer Carter. You didn't give me a reason, didn't even ask me any questions, just told me to get out of the car. And that whole time, I kept thinking, why me? What did I do?" That kind of treatment stays with you. It changes how you see the people who are supposed to protect you. The room was thick with tension, but Officer Carter didn't shy away. He took the microphone, looking directly at Javier. "You're right," he admitted, his voice soft but steady. "I remember that night, and looking back, I realized that I let my own biases get in the way. I can't undo what happened, but I'm here to tell you that I'm working to change. I'm here tonight to listen, to learn, and to become a better officer." A silence filled the room as Javier and Officer Carter held each other's gaze. Mr. Anderson felt the weight of the moment. Two men from different walks of life, bridging the divide between them with nothing more than honesty and a willingness to confront difficult truths. As the forum drew to a close, Marcus invited everyone to share one final reflection. When the microphone reached Tamara, her voice was thoughtful, her previous skepticism softened by the night's rawness. "I came here tonight because I wanted to hold people accountable," she began, her eyes scanning the room. "But hearing these stories, seeing officers like Carter and Morgan actually listen and respond, it's given me hope. We've all got a long way to go, but tonight feels like a real start. And I'm willing to work with you if you're willing to keep showing up." The crowd erupted into applause, a spontaneous outpouring of support and solidarity. Mr. Anderson felt a surge of pride as he looked around, seeing the faces of people who, despite their fears and frustrations, had come together to begin healing the wounds that divided them. As the forum concluded, people lingered, forming small groups to continue the conversations. Mr. Anderson watched as neighbors and officers exchanged handshakes, smiles, and even a few tentative laughs. He saw Officer Carter and Javier engaged in a quiet conversation, their expressions softened by the vulnerability they had shared. And he saw Marcus standing with a group of young people, his face alight with hope as they talked about ways to stay involved. The Voices of Oakwood Forum became a turning point. In the weeks that followed, the coalition's work grew stronger, bolstered by the momentum of that first night. They launched a mentorship program that paired officers with young people from the community, creating spaces for dialogue and understanding. They organized workshops on empathy, bias, and communication, inviting both residents and officers to participate. And as each event unfolded, the walls that had once separated Oakwood's residents from its police force began to crumble, piece by piece. For Mr. Anderson, the journey was both humbling and inspiring. He had witnessed change before, but this was different. This was his community coming together, not just to demand change, but to be part of it. And each time he saw neighbors and officers talking, laughing, and working side by side, he felt a profound sense of hope. One evening, as he walked home from a coalition meeting, Mr. Anderson paused by the park bench where it had all started. He sat down, gazing out at the peaceful scene before him. The sky was dark, but the streetlights cast a warm glow across the park, illuminating the quiet beauty of his neighborhood. And in that moment, he felt an overwhelming gratitude, not just for the coalition, but for the resilience and strength of his community. Oakwood was changing, and for the first time in a long time, Mr. Anderson believed that this change would last. Trials and triumphs. The Oakwood Community Coalition for Justice and Understanding had grown from a handful of concerned residents into a movement that was reshaping the fabric of the neighborhood. People who once passed each other on the street with little more than a nod now gathered regularly, forging bonds and sharing stories. The mentorship program between local youth and officers was thriving, and the monthly Voices of Oakwood forums had become a cornerstone of the coalition's work. Each month, new faces joined the discussions, each with a story, a hope, or a frustration that brought them to the community center. As the coalition grew, however, so did the challenges it faced. In Oakwood, as in so many places, change was not always welcomed by everyone. There were whispers of skepticism from some community members who felt the coalition was too lenient on the police, as well as from some officers who felt they were under constant scrutiny. Despite these undercurrents, Mr. Anderson and Marcus remained steadfast, committed to guiding Oakwood through these growing pains. But one crisp October evening, an event would test the coalition's unity like never before. It began as a routine evening for the community. Families were finishing dinner, and streetlights cast a warm glow across the quiet, tree-lined streets. Mr. Anderson was at home, preparing for the coalition's upcoming event, a workshop on communication and empathy, which had been eagerly anticipated by both residents and officers. He was reviewing his notes when his phone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet of his study. "Hello, Mr. Anderson. This is Marcus." The voice on the other end was tense, edged with urgency. "Marcus, is everything all right?" Mr. Anderson's heart began to race. "There's been an incident. I'm heading to the community center now. I think you should come." Without another word, Mr. Anderson grabbed his coat and made his way to the center. His mind raced as he walked, fearing the worst but hoping, somehow, that it wasn't as serious as it seemed. When he arrived, he found a crowd already gathered outside the building. The tension in the air was palpable, voices hushed and faces lined with worry. At the heart of the commotion was Officer Carter, his face tight with stress as he stood near his patrol car. Across from him was a young man, maybe 17 or 18, with fire in his eyes and fists clenched. A woman, presumably his mother, stood by his side, her face a mix of fear and anger. Marcus met Mr. Anderson at the edge of the crowd, pulling him aside to explain. Apparently, there was a confrontation. Marcus began, his voice low. Officer Carter stopped this young man, Jamal, for riding his bike without a light. Things escalated, and words were exchanged. Now, Jamal's family is here, and they're furious. Mr. Anderson closed his eyes, his heart heavy. This was precisely the kind of incident they had been working to prevent. Do we know exactly what happened? Not yet, Marcus replied, but tempers are running high. The coalition's efforts have been good, but this is a reminder that things are still fragile. Taking a deep breath, Mr. Anderson walked over to where Officer Carter and Jamal's family stood. He approached slowly, his presence a calming force that drew the attention of those around him. Jamal's mother turned to him, her eyes filled with both respect and frustration. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice tight with emotion, "I know you've been working hard to bring this community together, but look at what's happening. My son was just riding his bike, and he gets treated like a criminal." Mr. Anderson placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, nodding. "I understand," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "Let's take a moment to hear everyone's side. We're here to get to the bottom of what happened and to make sure that everyone feels safe and heard." He then turned to Officer Carter, whose face betrayed his own frustration and exhaustion. "Officer Carter," Mr. Anderson said, his tone even, "could you explain what happened from your perspective?" Officer Carter hesitated, then nodded. "I saw Jamal riding his bike without a light, which is dangerous at this time of night. I stopped him to let him know, but I think I came across more harshly than I meant to. I could tell he was upset, and well, things got heated." He paused, then added, "I'm sorry for how it all went down. That wasn't my intention." Jamal stepped forward, his face a mixture of anger and disappointment. "You didn't just stop me. You treated me like I was up to something. You didn't even listen when I tried to explain. You just assumed I was doing something wrong." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Mr. Anderson felt the weight of the tension settle heavily over him. He knew that, at this moment, they were standing at a precipice, one that could either deepen the division they were trying to mend or bring them closer together. Marcus stepped in, his calm authority adding weight to his words. "I think we all recognize that tonight didn't go the way any of us would have wanted, but we also have a chance to address it directly, right here, right now. Jamal, Officer Carter, if you're both willing, perhaps we can sit down and talk through this, as a community." Both Jamal and Officer Carter hesitated, their expressions uncertain. But with Mr. Anderson's encouraging nod, they agreed to a private conversation inside the community center, away from the watchful eyes of the crowd. Inside, Mr. Anderson, Marcus, Jamal, his mother, and Officer Carter sat in a circle. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence a heavy reminder of the challenges they faced. Finally, Mr. Anderson broke the silence, his voice gentle but firm. "This is why we created the coalition," he began, "so that when these moments happen, we can address them together. I know this situation has hurt both of you in different ways, but let's take this opportunity to really listen to each other." Jamal was the first to speak, his voice tinged with frustration. "I was just minding my own business, Mr. Anderson. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but the moment I saw those lights, I felt guilty, even though I hadn't done anything. And that's what gets me. It's like I'm always one step away from being treated like a criminal." Officer Carter listened, his face softening with understanding. "I get it, Jamal," he replied quietly. "I really do. I know my actions sent the wrong message. I stopped you because I was worried about your safety, but I didn't communicate that in the right way. I apologize for that. I'm learning, and I'm sorry." Jamal's mother looked at the officer, her expression wary but softened by his words. "We just want to feel like our kids are safe, like they can move around their own neighborhood without fear. Can you understand that?" Officer Carter nodded, his face somber. "I do. And I'm committed to making sure we do better by you and by this community." The conversation continued, the words sometimes raw, sometimes tinged with emotion, but always grounded in a shared desire to find a way forward. By the end of the meeting, while there was no miraculous resolution, there was a glimmer of mutual understanding, a small but significant step. In the days that followed, The coalition took the incident as a learning opportunity, gathering residents and officers to discuss how they could prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. They implemented a training program for officers focused on empathy and cultural understanding, bringing in local residents to share their perspectives directly. The mentorship program was expanded, allowing young people like Jamal to build relationships with officers outside of confrontational encounters, fostering mutual respect. As time passed, the coalition's work began to yield tangible results. The forums became places of open dialogue and mutual support, and the mentorship program blossomed, creating unexpected friendships and bonds. Officer Carter, once a symbol of division, became one of the coalition's strongest advocates, often speaking to new officers about the importance of treating Oakwood's residents with respect and understanding. But the coalition didn't just stop at healing the wounds between residents and law enforcement. It began to address the deeper issues that contributed to division and distrust, hosting workshops on economic opportunity, education, and mental health. They collaborated with local organizations to create job programs for young people, tutoring initiatives, and community events that celebrated Oakwood's rich cultural diversity. Mr. Anderson watched these changes unfold with a mixture of pride and humility. He saw neighbors who had once kept to themselves now joining in discussions, lending their voices to the coalition's work. He saw children who had once feared the police now playing games with officers in the park, their laughter filling the air with a new sense of hope. And he saw young people like Jamal, who had once felt alienated and targeted, stepping up to lead, their voices strong and confident. One evening, as the coalition held a community barbecue in Thompson Park, Mr. Anderson sat on his favorite bench, watching as people of all ages and backgrounds came together to share food, stories, and laughter. Officer Carter was there, flipping burgers with a smile as he chatted with residents. Marcus was deep in conversation with a group of young people, their faces alight with excitement as they discussed ideas for the coalition's future. A woman approached Mr. Anderson, her face warm with gratitude. "Thank you for everything you've done, Mr. Anderson," she said. "This community feels different now, safer, more united, and it's because of people like you." Mr. Anderson smiled, his heart full. "It's because of all of us," he replied. "We're only as strong as the connections we build, and Oakwood is stronger now because we've learned to trust and support each other." As the sun set over Oakwood, casting a warm glow across the park, Mr. Anderson reflected on the journey they had taken together. There would always be challenges, moments of doubt, and setbacks, but Oakwood had shown that, with unity and determination, a community could overcome even the deepest divisions. In that moment, surrounded by laughter, friendship, and the smell of barbecued food, Mr. Anderson knew that Oakwood's journey was far from over. But they were well on their way to becoming the community they had always dreamed of being. The legacy of Oakwood. As the leaves turned from vibrant green to shades of amber and crimson, the community of Oakwood found itself thriving in ways it hadn't before. The coalition's work was rippling through the lives of residents, reshaping how they saw themselves and each other. What had started as a small movement in response to a moment of injustice had grown into a transformative force, a community-led initiative built on the pillars of respect, empathy, and unity. With the holidays approaching, the coalition decided to celebrate by organizing Oakwood's first Unity Festival, a gathering that would bring together residents and officers, celebrating the diversity and strength of the neighborhood. Months of planning went into the event. Volunteers from every corner of Oakwood signed up, each bringing their unique talents and ideas to the table. Artists prepared to showcase their work, local musicians organized performances, and the culinary talents of Oakwood's residents promised a feast of cultural dishes representing the neighborhood's many backgrounds. Mr. Anderson played a central role in organizing the festival, overseeing the preparations with his signature calm and wisdom. Marcus, ever the energetic advocate, worked tirelessly by his side, securing sponsors, arranging logistics, and ensuring that everything was in place for the big day. They enlisted Officer Morgan, and even Officer Carter to help spread the word, reminding both residents and officers that this festival was a celebration of the progress they'd made together, and a pledge to continue building a better Oakwood. On the morning of the Unity Festival, Mr. Anderson arrived at the park early, taking a quiet moment to walk through the grounds before the festivities began. The park was draped with banners in bright colors, each bearing messages of hope, unity, and strength. Rows of tables had been set up, adorned with flowers and streamers, while a stage stood at the center, ready for the performances and speeches that would soon fill the air. As the sun rose higher in the sky, residents began to arrive. Families with young children, elders holding hands, teenagers in clusters, and officers in their uniforms all gathered, a vibrant tapestry of Oakwood's diversity. The festival grounds filled with laughter, the mingling scents of spices and roasted meats, and the warmth of neighbors reuniting in a space that felt truly communal. At noon, Marcus took to the stage, his face beaming as he looked out over the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice ringing with excitement. "Today, we're here to celebrate Oakwood, our community, our resilience, and the journey we've taken together. This festival is a testament to the power of unity. It's a reminder that when we come together, there's nothing we can't achieve." Applause filled the air, and Marcus continued, "This past year, we've seen so much growth. We've had difficult conversations, we've faced painful truths, and we've learned from each other. And through it all, we've built something beautiful. Oakwood isn't just a neighborhood, it's a family." He gestured to Mr. Anderson, who stood at the side of the stage, his face warm with pride. None of this would have been possible without the wisdom and guidance of Mr. Charles Anderson. His strength, resilience, and kindness have been a guiding light for all of us. "Mr. Anderson, would you do us the honor of saying a few words?" The crowd erupted into applause as Mr. Anderson took the stage, his heart pounding with emotion. He looked out over the sea of faces, some familiar, others new, but all filled with a shared spirit of hope. "Thank you, Marcus," he began, his voice soft but strong. "And thank you to each of you. It's an honor to stand here today and witness the beauty of this community. When I first sat down on that bench in the park, I never imagined that it would lead to something like this. But life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd, and Mr. Anderson continued, "This past year, we've been on a journey that has brought us closer to each other and closer to the vision we all share. We've learned that community isn't just about living near each other. It's about understanding each other, supporting each other, and standing up for each other." He paused, his gaze moving to Officer Carter and the other officers in the crowd. "I know there have been moments of pain, moments of mistrust, but I believe that, today, we're stronger because we chose to face those moments together. We chose to have faith in each other. We chose to believe that change is possible." The crowd was silent, each person absorbed in Mr. Anderson's words. He felt the weight of their collective hope and trust, the knowledge that Oakwood was indeed transforming, one conversation, one action, and one commitment at a time. "We're here today because we didn't let our differences divide us," he continued, his voice filled with emotion. "Instead, we let them bring us closer. And as long as we remember that, as long as we keep choosing unity over division, there's nothing we can't accomplish." A wave of applause filled the park, and Mr. Anderson stepped back, overwhelmed by the strength and unity he saw before him. This wasn't just his vision anymore, it was theirs. As the afternoon unfolded, the festival became a vivid celebration of Oakwood's spirit. People danced to live music, children painted murals, and local artists displayed their work, paintings, sculptures, and photographs that captured the essence of the neighborhood. Food stalls lined the park, each offering dishes that represented the many cultures within Oakwood. The aroma of spices, grilled meats, and baked goods filled the air, inviting everyone to savor the diversity of their community. At one of the tables, Mr. Anderson sat with a group of young people, including Jamal and several other students from Oakwood High School who had joined the coalition's mentorship program. They laughed and shared stories, their faces alight with excitement for the future. "Mr. Anderson, we've been thinking," Jamal began, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "What if we start a youth council as part of the coalition? We want to get more young people involved, give them a voice, and show them that they can make a difference." Mr. Anderson's face broke into a wide smile. "That's a wonderful idea, Jamal," he replied. "This community is yours too. You have every right to shape it, to make it better, and to lead." Inspired by Jamal's idea, the young people around the table began brainstorming ways to engage Oakwood's youth, organizing volunteer projects, hosting events, and creating spaces for open dialogue between teens and officers. Mr. Anderson listened, his heart swelling with pride as he saw the seeds of leadership and hope take root in the next generation. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow across the park, Mr. Anderson took a moment to reflect. This festival, this gathering of neighbors and friends, was more than just a celebration. It was a promise to continue building, to keep growing, and to remain united in the face of any challenge. He thought of all they had accomplished together. The coalition's oversight board had become a respected part of the community, providing transparency and accountability in ways that once seemed impossible. The youth mentorship program had expanded, with young people forging bonds with officers they once feared. And the forums, where residents and officers came together to listen and learn, had become spaces of healing and understanding. As the festival drew to a close, the crowd gathered one final time near the stage. Marcus stepped forward, raising his hand for silence. "Before we say goodnight, I want to ask everyone here to join me in a commitment to continue this work, to carry this spirit of unity with us in everything we do." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Marcus continued, "Let's make a promise to each other and to Oakwood, to stand up for what's right, to lift each other up, and to keep moving forward together." One by one, people raised their hands, pledging their commitment to the future of Oakwood. Mr. Anderson raised his hand as well, feeling the power of their collective resolve. This wasn't the end of their journey, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by the challenges of the past, but by the hope of the future. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Mr. Anderson looked around, taking in the faces of his neighbors, his friends, and his community. He felt an overwhelming sense of peace, a quiet joy that filled him with the knowledge that Oakwood was forever changed. They had built something lasting, something meaningful, and as long as they stood together, that legacy would endure. Walking home that evening, Mr. Anderson paused by his favorite bench in the park. He sat down, taking a moment to look out at the now quiet grounds, the remnants of the festival still scattered across the grass. In the silence, he felt the weight of his life's journey, the struggles, the victories, and the unyielding hope that had carried him through. A small group of young people walked past, waving to him and calling out, "Good night, Mr. Anderson." He waved back, a smile on his face, knowing that the future was bright because it was in their hands. As the stars appeared overhead, Mr. Anderson closed his eyes, letting the memories of the day wash over him. Oakwood had become a beacon of unity, a testament to the power of community, and a reminder that even in the face of adversity, change was always possible. And as he sat there, a soft breeze rustling the leaves around him, Mr. Anderson whispered a quiet promise to himself, a promise to continue this journey, to guide and support Oakwood as long as he was able, and to leave behind a legacy of hope that would carry on for generations to come.